Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Juan of Words podcast. I'm Juan Alanis.
My name is Angelica Casares. You see this? This is, what would you call this?
It's a backdrop.
It is a backdrop. Mm-hmm. Let me move this out of the way. So this is a backdrop. This is a cloth backdrop, and there's still some work that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. I don't know why I left this to the back, like behind us, but it's nice in here. It just looks a little like homemade. It is homemade, but it does need details. And this was $60. It was a quick backdrop. It was something we can do behind us, but hopefully at some point we'll have like a much more elaborate look. And
I'm not sure if it's actually showing up because it shows up like really like white, like in the. I don't know if you saw in the last video.
It is supposed to look a little bit. I wanted for it not to look completely white. It does have some gray tone to it, but it's just to fix like our face so we don't look yellow. We go very, I would say warm, like tremendously warm, and so we go yellow,
which is like something I had no idea about at all. So like this, like as we're learning these things,
it's some photography. You learn that. You learn quickly what look. Well, some I knew enough to know that white walls behind me make me look yellow. As
we're kind of like bringing people in, we started having conversations, and one of the topics that we had when we did the recap for our anniversary. So in March we did a recap of our like 11 of the past episodes so we pulled clips from. So if you haven't listened to that episode, you can go back, and I think that's the last one that we uploaded. One of the clips that was in there that we talked about had to do with grief, or it had to do with loss, and in that conversation it was more a conversation between us where we were sharing memories of our loved ones, and kind of thinking about that. Then I also thought, you know what, we should also interview our friend Leti, who we call her Leti, but her name is Leticia, and Leti happens to work for the Houston Area Women's Center here in Houston.
She doesn't happen to work for them.
Well, she works
purposely works for them. Yes. Sorry for Leticia works for the Houston Women's Area Center.
Houston Area Women's Center.
Yeah, what did I say?
Houston Women's Area Center.
Houston Area Women's Center. Oh my God. Okay, look,
it's
she works for the
It's Hawk. She works for Hawk.
Yes. So you had a conversation with her.
We basically talked a little bit about how within the conversation of grief, what she was talking about was grief within like a relationship. So when you're letting go of a relationship, or when you're coming out of a relationship, kind of how you deal with loss, and I guess the grieving process of that, which I guess a lot of times you wouldn't necessarily think about when you're thinking about.
Yeah, she did explain that it was a different kind of grief.
Yeah, like you wouldn't normally associate, I guess grief with leaving like an abusive domestic relationship, or even a sexual assault situation.
Yeah. And so insert clip here.
My full name is Leticia Manzano. I go by Leti to anyone who wants to be my friend. Thank you, Juan, for all this time of friendship, and for Angelica, of course. I work for the Houston Area Women's Center, and we are the Houston local rape crisis center and domestic violence shelter, and we provide a whole bunch of services to survivors. So we can talk more about that in a little while.
Yeah, and you're a advocate, right? You're really an advocate for.
That's a word that isn't really used outside of just our little community of advocates, but we tend to use the word advocate because it's more than just our job. It's kind of daily work. You can't unsee what you've seen, you can't unhear what you've heard, and so you want to advocate for people who don't have a voice.
That's interesting because, like, I think when you say advocate, I think sometimes now it's like more and more common where people say, "Oh, I'm an advocate for this, I'm an advocate for that." But I guess there's a lot more to that word than just saying, like, I'm an advocate.
Yeah. So I would say that my job is a supervisor. I'm actually the manager of sexual violence survivor services. And within that, I'm a counselor. Like, I actually work with survivors. I talk with them through their trauma and the healing process. But my job as an advocate is kind of to be on the lookout in anything that I can be involved with to make the world a better place for survivors of any kind of violence. And so it's looking at the law, it's talking to friends and family, it's what's on the news. It literally is a part of every day of my life.
Yeah. And speaking of seeing a lot, I'm sure that you've seen a lot because you've been doing this for a while now, right?
Yeah, so I just celebrated, because I do celebrate every year. I celebrated 23 years.
Wow, congratulations.
At the Women's Center. Thank
you say that easy, but no es fácil, right? I mean, you can't, like...
Yeah, like I have a big smile. 23 years is a long time, and there have been ups and downs through the whole thing. But I'm really proud of the work that my agency does, and that other people who do what I do are passionate about.
So what would you say are some of the most memorable things that you remember from those 23 years, like good or bad, like that I guess come to mind when you think about that?
So I think the number one thing is just thinking about different survivors that I've worked with over time, and just seeing them from kind of how they first came and how broken they were, how afraid they were, and seeing them find themselves, find their voice again, becoming really empowered. And some of them even have gone on to do media for us or talk to other survivors. And so I've seen this evolution, this reclaiming of their own power. So I have memories of very specific clients that I've worked with. I also have great memories of the wonderful staff that I have met along the years. Some of them are just amazing people, like just big hearts and I'm going to say big muscles, but, you know, a lot of strength, not physical strength always necessarily, but just very strong people who are committed to social change. Yeah,
and I imagine you have to have that strength in order to be in this field, because it's like you said, you see a lot of different things. And does it change you? Does the job change you? You know, when you first started, 23 years ago to now, like, would you say that the job has changed you in some way?
I want to say that it helped me grow. I want to say that I'm the same person I'm stumbling through, with more words, with a better understanding of the world. But more importantly, and those who know me and my family has finally accepted, 23 years later, that this is my daily life. It's not something that I leave when I leave the office. I can sometimes just see a person at the store and somehow they'll see me. We'll be in line together, and, the smile or the not smile, and it's like, I know. But it's interesting how I'll just meet somebody at Lowe's. I met a man at Lowe's recently, and he was telling me that he's a laborer, and if I need help with anything, and I was like, no, thank you, I'm just here for a couple of things, and he was like, oiga señora, what do you do? And so I was like, well, actually, and I tell him briefly, because I'm trying to get my stuff and go, and he's like, pues fíjese que tengo una hija, I have a daughter. And he starts to tell me his story. And I find it interesting that happens more often than not. But I'm also grateful that I can help in some way.
And was it somebody that typically that you would have seen, that you would have thought like that would have approached you, or was it kind of like sometimes we have stereotypes of, especially like of a Hispanic man, that like, they won't talk about those things. But was it somebody that you kind of were like, I expected it, or was it kind of unexpected?
I wasn't paying attention, so he noticed me before I noticed him.
Yeah.
And he was just trying to get a job, which I think is great. I think because I also live in a Latino community. It was going to be a Latino. But I hadn't noticed him, and I don't know, sometimes something about people says there's something about you, and I don't know what it is, but it can be in any community, which is very interesting. Like, I can be at a shop in the River Oaks area, not that I always shop at River Oaks, but, Avalon Stationery. I was at a stationery store once just trying to buy a journal and a pen, and I was wearing my lanyard, and it had, something on it that just told someone like, hey, do you know about this? And I was like, yes, absolutely. And they were like, well, I have a friend who needs shelter. And sometimes it's actual survivors who just come up to me and say, do you know where I can get help?
Yeah. Well, that's pretty impressive, but I would think probably like a little bit of it's probably like the way you carry yourself and the way that you're very confident and that you present yourself. I feel like, like somebody could approach.
Yeah, and so we were talking a little bit earlier about like what how has my work impacted me, and one of the things I'll mention now is that I've learned how to be approachable, you know, and we just talked about how it takes a long time to be able to talk about domestic violence in a way that is not off-putting to someone. So 23 years ago, you know, I was a little shyer, definitely, and I was a little bit angry about the issues. And just wanted to maybe correct people versus like, let's have a conversation. And I know you're not the only one that thinks this way, but I'm not here to argue or to change. I just kind of want to tell you my point of view and tell you a little bit about my experience versus, you know, in your early 20s, for those of any of you who are activists or advocates, you can be pretty off-putting sometimes, and I'm speaking from experience.
Well, I think in any career, like I think when you come fresh out of college and you like you think you know because you learned in a classroom, and you come out here and you know then all of a sudden you realize like, oh, there are a lot of other skills that you have to kind of put in place too before you can actually do things. But I would imagine that especially in your field, why is it important to be approachable, Leti?
Well, if you have something to say, if what you have to say is important, you want people to be able to hear it. And if you're in any way coming off as rude or a know-it-all or I don't have time, then your word is not going to get out there. You have to be open in order for people to hear what you have to say. And one of the very first things about being approachable is being a good listener. It's interesting because we have something to say and we want people to listen to us, but they're not going to hear you unless you hear them first.
Because a lot of times I say people are like, when you're speaking to somebody, you're not actually listening because you're thinking about kind of what you're going to say next.
Yes, and sometimes you make it about yourself and it reminds you about something about you. And it's like, no, be mindful, be present, listen to what they're saying, like really stop thinking if you can. And that's a big skill to learn.
I feel like as you get older, it's also like you realize that like it's not always about you, you know?
Yes.
Like,
That's a huge one.
So like I imagine that like that's part of it too, is like you take yourself out of the equation in some way, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great skill that I learned probably from my starting point in being a counselor is active listening. Like, what is the person really saying? Can you say back to them what they just said to you? Can you figure out what they may be feeling? You know, they didn't tell you how they felt, but they're telling you something, and maybe you can figure out how it made them feel or how they're feeling in that moment. So I think again, listening is super important, and it makes you more approachable. When people feel heard, they feel more trusting and to listen to you.
So I kind of brought you here on the guys that I wanted to talk to you about a grief.
Yes,
now, when I say
sure.
guys, I don't think that's probably not the word.
No, you told me straight up, and we went straight into domestic violence and
I'm
sexual
assault. I'm probably using the word wrong, but like no,
we're good.
You back up on your bullshit, don't belong to me. You acting all sleazy, I don't like what I see. I got all the game, don't get fucked in your brain. I can do you worse than you ever did me first.
Hey, this is Angelica Casares.
And this is Juan Alanis.
Thank you so much for joining us on season 2 of Juana Words Podcast. You can find us on
Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, on Stitcher, Spotify, and other platforms. Also on our website at juanawords.com. And we hope you enjoyed the episode that you're listening to right now.
And if you enjoyed it, you can leave us a review and a thumbs up. Especially on the Apple platform, the higher ratings and the reviews we get, the more listeners we actually can be found by.
Yeah.
So
it really does help us. So we really would appreciate it, a rating or a review on Apple Podcast. And until next time, thank
see
you.
you then. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Back up on my piece shit, I don't care if you don't like it. I'm really different, don't gotta show you I'm like that. Like the baby.
What I kind of talked to you about was like grief in a domestic violence situation. I guess the grief of losing a relationship.
It's actually, we talk about it all the time. Maybe this past week I do a support group for domestic and sexual violence survivors where they experience sexual violence in their relationship. And I also do a support group for sexual violence survivors that don't have that are not there specifically for domestic violence. They're there because of rape or childhood sexual abuse. But the topic of grief comes up, and I want to say this past week I brought it up because losing a relationship is very painful. And I have seen survivors go through some of the things that are called, the stages of grief. And while I'm hesitant sometimes to talk about the stages of grief because it's not linear. It's not like, oh, you start off with the sadness and the depression, and then you move to the anger, and then you move. It's not like that. Whenever a person experiences grief, it's because they've experienced a loss, and I am bilingual and I work with a lot of Spanish speakers, so I tend to, as you could tell already from our interview, I tend to throw in both languages, but I talk to our clients a lot about loss, and we call them pérdidas, perdiste algo, you lost something. And it can be a lot of things. It's not just the loss of the relationship, the loss of that partner. It's the loss of hope. It's a loss of your dreams, of having found the right person and wanting to build a family with them. And for many, many people, when they get into a relationship, they want it to not only be long-term, they want it to be lifelong. And so losing a relationship is more than just a breakup, for example.
Yeah, it's one thing, I guess, to break up because you agree that you no longer want to be together. But I guess it's different when you've been, the person that you're leaving or has left you, is your abuser, right?
Yes, and I don't know if the community knows, but it's not an easy thing to get out of that relationship. There is fear for a lot of domestic violence survivors, and many of them, of course, are afraid to leave because afraid of what's going to happen if they leave, afraid of being, further physically abused or even killed. Absolutely. But in domestic violence relationships where let's say that there isn't that fear, it's the emotional part. It's like I am invested emotionally in this person, and I have worked so hard to make this work, and this person keeps telling me they're going to change, and they're not going to change. So there is that investment and losing in that way. It's losing many times the father of your children. It is losing trust in people, and definitely I've seen a loss of trust in men. If you can imagine losing trust in half of the world, right? Like 51% of the world, I believe, is female right now. But losing trust in half of the world, that sounds crazy. So there are a lot of losses, and we talk about sadness, and we talk about, depression. We talk about how hard it is to bury something that isn't physical. It's hard to, let's say, to say goodbye when that person is still living and you know them and you might see them if you share custody or just if they're around the family. So it's a very different type of grief, but it is grief in itself, and it takes a long time. It's not anything quick, as with any grief.
Do people recognize that they need to deal with it as grief, or is that like a process in and of itself? So for people to say that, oh, I have to grieve this relationship, or
it's kind of, I think it doesn't dawn on survivors by themselves. Like we bring it up, we're like, let's compare it to this, and then it makes sense to them. It kind of clicks on a light, and we even use the words, guardando luto. So in the Latino culture, there's a time in your life. I remember my mom for months and months and months and months after her father died, she wore black, like to signify that she had experienced a loss. And she was, there was a time that she didn't allow us to listen to music or, but she was grieving. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of plan with our clients who are survivors, like, how are you going to grieve? What are some things that you can do? What are some rituals that might be helpful for you? And we make it a few sessions if we're doing individual counseling, and we definitely bring it up in group sessions on and off, in a period of 8 to 12 weeks. So it is a big topic, and it is very important. And then also to remember that there are children involved in many cases, and they're grieving. Children have a hard time with their parents divorcing, period.
Yeah.
But when there's domestic violence, there's an added sadness to that.
And is the process the same? Is it like the steps are the same as like when you grieve the loss of a loved one, like because they passed away? Are the steps the same?
The steps can be the same when the child is not going to have access to the other parent anymore, and usually it's the father. So either because he doesn't want access to them anymore, maybe he's moved on, he started a new family, maybe because he's in jail. If he was arrested and he's going to be in prison for long term, that's a big loss. And then sometimes it's court mandated. If there's a protective order and he cannot come around the children because he was also abusive to the children, children love their parents despite how they're treated, and it's a big loss for them. And so,
despite how they treat the other parent.
And despite how they treat the other parent. And so it is something that we need to talk to moms about, that their children are going to experience the same effects, even if they didn't experience the abuse themselves.
Yeah, and sometimes they can blame like the parent, even though maybe the parent that left or was the abused parent, they still may blame them, and say like, oh, you should have stayed, or
it's about half and half. I find I think it's amazing when women leave relationships because their children ask them to. They're like, Mommy, we should leave. Mommy, you don't deserve this. And, Mom, Dad treats you bad, and that's not okay. So that's heartbreaking. But it's also heartbreaking when we have a client who has a child who's like, I hate you. I don't have my dad because of you, or my dad is in jail because of you. And so it is very difficult, and one of the services that we offer at the Houston Area Women's Center is counseling for children who have witnessed domestic violence.
Yeah.
I think that that's really important, and sometimes because we're called the Women's Center doesn't mean we don't work with children or youth, and it also doesn't mean that we don't work with men. We also see male survivors of domestic violence.
And that's the thing, like I think if you, as a kid, if you see domestic violence, it stays with you for your lifetime, like, because there are issues that... There are issues that stay with you for a very long time. That you don't realize that you have, like the way that you as an adult function has to do a lot with the way that what you might have experienced in a domestic violence situation too.
Yes, we actually ask in our first interview with the clients. We call it an intake, but it's an interview to just get to know a little bit about their story. And we ask them if they witnessed domestic violence when they were growing up. And, oftentimes it's yes. My father treated my mother this way. But we also ask them if their partner, the abusive partner, experienced child abuse or witnessed domestic violence. And again, often enough, the answer is yes. So it's a cycle. It's a generational cycle that can be broken. And the wonderful thing is that all of the survivors who I've ever worked with don't want their children to go through something like that. And some of them start off counseling because they want a different life for their children. And they get to the point where it's like, but it's important to have a different life for yourself. You and I met about a year after my best friend died suddenly. Her name is Liz Alexander. And it was just a sudden thing. And let me tell you, it took me 5 years to grieve her loss. 5 full years. I remember that I was not enjoying life the way that I had before for a long time. And I remember the first Christmas that I actually felt happy. And not just I'm showing up for the kids, I'm showing up for my family, but where I was actually joyful. And it was different when my dad passed. My dad was, 85 years old. He had already told me for a couple of years, when God's ready to take me, I'm ready. He's like, all my children are grown. I've met all my grandchildren. So it's very different how you might grieve a loss. And you can grieve losing a job. You can grieve losing a pet. You can grieve so many different things in life. And I think it's important for, the people who are listening to the podcast today to know that it's okay to name it grief. It's okay to call it that. And don't compare it to anybody else's loss. It's your loss and it's important to you. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. But it's also important to recognize that this could be grief.
Yeah. And that Christmas that you remember like enjoying it again, was that like 5 years later?
It was 5 years later. I mean, I could count. You can see pictures of me from those years. And I'm not going to say I didn't experience any joy, but I had lost a lot of it. And it was like I was just going through the motions many times. But I remember Christmas specifically was a fun time for both of us. Like we just shared an affinity for this time and spending time with our families, and giving each other gifts, and just like this wonderful relationship that we had with each other and Christmas. And I just couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel it for a long time. And then finally it was like, wait a minute, like I'm excited about going today, and I'm excited about dressing up, and
it gives you like does it give you like a sense of appreciation in a way, like for like being able to enjoy those things again?
Yeah. And someone who I'm going to mention, Brene Brown, she's a social worker here in Houston. She's written a lot of books on a lot of important subjects. But one of the things that she taught me is that you cannot experience great joy without experiencing great loss. Like you have to know one to really know the other. And I think that what you said right now reminded me of that.
That's pretty deep. I was going to ask you, you threw me off with that again.
Sorry.
I was like,
I'm
hey,
good.
That was kind of deep. I'm still like wrapping my mind around it. But no, I think I guess what I was going to ask you, like for the people that like are maybe starting their grief journey, or they're in the middle of their grief journey, like what would you say, you know, as somebody that works professionally, but then also somebody who's experienced grief yourself?
I would say, and this sounds like a platitude, and what I hated the most when people were showing their compassion for my situation when I was grieving, you know, I heard things like, oh, she's in a better place, and all these things that were not helpful to me. And I don't mean this from a place of platitudes, but I just want you to know that eventually you will feel joy again, and not just because it's happened for me. I've seen it happen with other people, like just in my own experience with my friend, like she was friends with other people, and the time that it took for them to feel joy was different than mine, but they did feel joy again. This Friday marked her 11th anniversary of her death. Wow. And, you know, the way her mother grieved was different, but she was able to feel joy again. And it doesn't mean that you've forgotten the person. That's another big thing, or forgotten the loss that you've had. There's going to be guilt when you start to feel that joy, like you almost don't want to. But my message is that you can be hopeful that you'll move past the pain at some point. And the pain will be there, but it will be different. Because I'm afraid for people who get so depressed and hopeless, and I will say it because I think it needs to be said, people have contemplated suicide after the loss of a person in their life, usually after death or after a relationship. And I want to instill in anyone that there is hope, that you will feel differently, that you will feel happy about things again, that you will experience joy, because hopelessness is a hard place to be.
Yeah. Wow. No, I don't think it could be better said. I think that you nailed it. I think that's true, and I agree with you on that. It's been really nice to see kind of how you've been working in the community for such a long time. Thanks. And all the work that you've been doing. But thank you for being here and putting up with the questions, because I know I've been like asking a bunch of questions, but we'd love to have you back, I think, at some point. And you know,
absolutely,
I think you have a lot of great insight to share. But I
would love to come back.
All right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I thought it was a good conversation. I think sometimes it's very hard to let go and grieve a relationship when the person is still around, especially like she said, when it comes to like the parents and the kids, like you letting go of that person. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a different sense of grief. You know. I don't know how much of that I related to, because I don't think I'm the best at it, but I do.
You're not the best at what?
I don't think I'm the best at I'm not the best at like to have that conversation of like, oh, it is what it is. I mean, I go through, and you've seen me go through steps where I don't mind completely letting go of people. Whether it's because it's due time or because of whatever, and I rekindled relationships and friendships. Not often. I've done it maybe twice, 3 times. After I thought our friendship was over. But I don't hold on too much to things, and I maybe that's why I'm like, I understand. I don't know. Maybe that's why I'm depressed at some times where I'm constantly like letting go of things. You
think because you let go of things too easily
not easily. Like I really, like I can mourn them. I can really give them an upset and be like, okay, it is what it is. Like I have to learn to let go.
I wasn't sure, like, because when we talked about it, when I reached out to her, I just mentioned, like, real brief, I was like, so I want to have a conversation about grief, and I want to talk about maybe how it relates to a relationship, but I didn't really, like, I wasn't sure, like, if she thought that it did or didn't. So I guess what she shared about, when she started talking about, no, actually this is something that we do as part of the work that we do, like the work that they do, I guess, with survivors, which is what they call people who, are working with. So she said that's part of the work that we do with survivors. So like they actually, like, we talk to them about grief and as part of the relationship, which to me, I guess in my subconscious, it kind of made sense, because I was like, well, yeah, like, especially when you're talking about a partnership between somebody that you've been had in your life for a long period of time. It's like you're losing them, not because they passed away. You're losing them because they, you can't be together, or you choose not to be together.
Like if you were married for the person for like 20 years and, and you had to move on from it, and that they're still there and that it just can never work between y'all. But 20 years gone, not only do you mourn, I guess, them, or you grieve over them, but you grieve over like all that time that you felt. All that
time in your life, right? 20 years of your life.
Not your life that was lost, but that you gave to one person.
And I guess the other thing was just what we talked about in terms of like how there's not a right or wrong way to grieve.
Yeah, how there's those okay, so how they talk about where there's like those, what is it, 6 steps, 12 steps, 4 steps. I don't know.
I know there's steps.
You go
I don't
through
know how
them,
many,
right?
But I know there's steps.
Where you're like angry, there's acceptance, anger, or you deny it and stuff like that. She's like, there's no real right way. Like, I guess in order.
There's not really an order. Like, you don't have to necessarily follow one way. Right?
Yeah. There's really no right way to grieve a loss. Yeah. We talked about loss, but it can be loss of any kind: loss of a relationship, loss of a friendship, a loved one, a past relationship. When it comes to grieving, like the only thing I can compare it, like the losses to, the only thing I compare grief to is like my different losses, right? So like the death of my sister was like the first kind of death that I experienced like that. And then it was my cousin. And so the way I'm grieving them is a little bit different.
Which is kind of what she shared about, like the way she had lost a very close friend, and then when she lost her dad, it wasn't that one meant more than the other. It was just that she said my dad had been telling us, and my dad had kind of been preparing us for that. So she kind of knew that he was an older gentleman. It was eventually going to happen. So that was different, than the way her friend who's young, who's about her age, and just unexpectedly passed away.
So I remember the loss of my sister really set me in motion to like it got me being very grateful, right, of things and my family and the time I had with her and the loss of life that and then it made me very like angry too. To the point where I was not functioning, right? And so then the loss of my cousin really set my ass into action. I was like, okay, like I have to do something that I feel like I'm doing, like I'm making a purpose. And so you do, even though the life of loss is the same, the way you kind of grieve it is different.
I like the way you said that, because I think one made you feel one way, but then by the end of it you felt like, well, not by the end of it, but by the when your cousin passed away, it was kind of a kick in the butt for you. Like you were like, oh, you know what? Like time is precious. I gotta do something.
Yeah. Well, not only is time precious, but my sister was young, and my cousin was younger.
Yeah. No.
And so I was like, fuck, dude. I didn't think of my mortality. I thought so more of like what am I, like, we were reliving memories, yes, but that thrive to, like, you know what I'm saying? Like there's this like, I don't know, like things just fall and you're like, I don't understand why it's falling. I thought I built it correctly. I thought this was solid.
In terms of what? I think
my feelings. I think in terms of my feelings, in terms of like
your feelings were like falling apart.
Solid. Yeah, in terms of like my feelings were solid. Like what I'm doing today made sense. But then after the loss of both of them, I was like, nothing makes sense. This is all shit. Like this is weird. We talk about time as if, you know, so freely, as if it's more like as if it's less than money, as if it's less than everything else, and it's so fucking valuable, and we take it for granted. We take it time for granted a lot, and we never set things, sometimes in my belief, we never set things into motions to not only make us happy today, right here, right now, the present, but the near future and the later future, if it's there. And so I don't know, you know, like we wasted away so freely, and that's what kicked me in the ass, and I was like, okay, this can't be it. Like in the memory of like Erica and Kathy, this cannot be it.
When you say like this cannot be it, like I guess what do you mean, like this cannot be it? Like it's like, I guess like that moment, the moment that you were in cannot be it.
Yeah, like when we lost my cousin and the way I felt, and I felt helpless. I obviously we weren't prepared, but I felt completely helpless. Yeah. I couldn't help in any form or way that could possibly like help my aunt, help my cousin. I couldn't help my mom. I was like, I need to one, do a better job of educating myself. 3, set things into motion that's gonna leave maybe not a legacy, but that's gonna leave like maybe a footprint for somebody else to follow. And the footprint that I was leaving wasn't the one that I wanted to leave. Yeah. So I was like, sense. You know what I mean? So I was like, this can't be it. This cannot be it. And so, and in the process of that, like they have to be like memorialized. My sister Erica and Kathy, they have to be, and so that's what I'm working on too. And I was like, no, they have to be memorialized, and if we have another, if there's another passing, we will memorialize them also. Like it can't just be like a gravestone of like their name or like a plaque, or it needs to be more than just that.
No, I think that makes sense. And like speaking of memorializing, like that was the other conversation that I had was with somebody, you know, was an artist, and you know, we talked.
I didn't get to hear that conversation.
Oh, you didn't get to hear it?
No, I didn't.
But I think I mentioned it to you, but I'll recap a little bit of kind of how it went. And so we had this conversation, and you know, she basically was sharing. So her story is, you know, that her boyfriend at the time, who they had been dating, they weren't engaged yet, they weren't married yet, but they were together, and they had a relationship, and you know, he passed away kind of tragically, where, you know, unexpectedly, you know, he was caught in it was a crime that happened, and you know, he passed away as a result of the crime that happened. And so you know, after it happened, you know, one of the ways that she started dealing with her grief is he created games. So he was in the gaming industry where he was working on a game, and
he was a developer. Like a software engineer developer.
Yeah, I don't know if he was a software engineer. I think he was just like, he had a partner. So I think both of them together were creating like this game, this idea they had for game. And part of it involved like virtual reality. So like a virtual reality kind of experience. And so what she ended up doing, you know, she took her, because she was an artist also, so she's a performer, she acts and does different things, and so one of the things that she did is she blended both of what her artistry, and then she wanted to bring kind of his virtual reality game experience concept to life in some way. So she put together a one-woman show. The one-woman show was like on Zoom because it was during the pandemic.
Okay.
So it was happening on Zoom, and it was really like, she starts out and she shows videos of him, and she the whole time she's kind of talking about their relationship. I thought her perspective was really interesting. I wanted to include it just because I the way that her situation happened, and the way that she decided to, as part of her grieving process, to have
Did you see this show?
Yeah.
You've seen it?
Yeah, I did see the show.
Okay.
And I thought it was pretty powerful. I mean, I thought it was a pretty powerful show, but what I really liked about what she shared with me was just that it helped her by like paying tribute to him.
So Julie, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it very much. I could go on and describe your career, but I think you could probably do a better job than I can, and you probably do it more justice. So tell me a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing.
So I'm a multimedia performer and producer. I produced video documentary series at HuffPost and Thrillist, and most recently I've been producing podcasts for Audible. And I am also a stand-up comedian and a musician. I performed before the pandemic. I would perform around Brooklyn, but now during the pandemic, I have been performing a solo show called Delejos, From Afar, in which I take a journey through the virtual reality video game design of the game called Delejos that my partner Jose Zambrano left just before he passed away. He unexpectedly passed away in November of 2019. And so, left without any answers, I decided to take a trip through his game, which he created after his own experience of forced immigration from Venezuela. And in the game, he sends players on a journey to connect to something they love from afar. And so all of a sudden, it felt like he left a lot of answers potentially in the game. So now I do that over Zoom. The show runs over Zoom live. I live score it on my electric guitar. And it weaves in and out of virtual reality, stand-up comedy, and again, live music and kind of storytelling.
And so the VR piece of it is kind of interesting because it's not what you would traditionally think of as VR. So could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So we'll say no headsets VR, no headsets required. Essentially, I encourage the audience to close their eyes and I guide them through a VR experience. So sitting in front of your computer, you can close your eyes and look all around you and see that you're completely immersed in a different world. The VR comes in and out of kind of what I envision to be his fever dreams, to kind of envision a different perspective and a different reality within the grief that I'm experiencing. Because it was so unexpected, the incident and his coma was so unexpected. I just had so much to say to him and he felt so far away. And so writing to him was kind of the only way that I could express that and kind of get that energy out and feel like I was connected to him. We were also creative collaborators in addition to dating. And so we were doing these projects both in VR and comedy, and we were starting a band. And so the three elements that ended up being the backbone of this show are also a continuation of the promises that we made together. So it was really only after he died that I decided, okay, I'm going to commit myself to writing some sort of project that is about him, about us, and uses the language that we were creating to tell that story.
Right.
And really just came to life from the writing that I was doing to process what was happening.
Have you experienced any of that where, people were kind of surprised or maybe taken aback by, your approach to grief?
Yeah, a little bit. I think it's always hard when there's a group of people grieving and then one person, I've just been very public with this, mostly because I was propelled to share the way that he saw the world. I don't think it's like everybody's approach to grieve in front of people, but because he left me at the top of the roller coaster, which is this feeling of like being more future than past, being more plans and memories. We had just started, we had just fallen in love. Because I was left at that moment when we parted, I felt like I had so much to share and I had so much energy. You know, you don't lose, it's not often that you lose someone just after you've fallen in love with them. You're almost in that stage where, you know, you haven't had a fight yet, you haven't hurt each other yet, you haven't betrayed each other in any way. And I think everybody is at that point with someone in their life, and then maybe they forget about it because those hardships come along, and we kind of lose the preciousness of what that person, the beauty of that person could have meant to us. You know, there's a lot of other ways that we build a greater love besides that, but since we were kind of at that sweet spot of just having fallen in love, I just felt like I needed to tell everybody that I knew about him. And I didn't have a chance to introduce him to all the people that I loved. So this show is that too. And you know, I think I've been really hard on myself through this grief process. What I learned more and more is that a lot of people think that they're not grieving right. Like a lot of people have imposter syndrome in their grief, where they think, I shouldn't be feeling this way. You know, something that I felt was, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I haven't known him for that long. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I don't even have a real picture of us together. You know, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I haven't known him for years like this other person has known him. But that can really stifle your own feelings and keep you from feeling what you're actually feeling. So this piece, again, is, you know, kind of me processing all of that in front of other people so that they can hopefully also find themselves in their own grief journeys too. My relationship to the show has changed a little bit. The show essentially bottles up, you could almost call it magical thinking that existed in those first few weeks of grief, where it felt like, you know, I felt like I was at rock bottom, and because of that, there was so much magic that existed, and there was this really clear path to hope that started to crystallize in front of me. And so I wanted to bottle that up, all that energy. I wanted to bottle it up because I knew that it would fade. You know, when we're at the edge of tragedy, there's so much hope that exists. We have so many questions. And for me, I just decided to start listening for answers. And I knew that once the grief started to not quite fade, but once the acceptance started to come in, that the noise of the real world would come back. And it has, but I wanted to kind of bottle that up so that I could always tap into that, and kind of embedded in that is my forever connection to him. And so my relationship with the show has changed a bit too.
So go back a little bit. You said something about tragedy and hope. Can you repeat what you said?
Yeah. So it's kind of like when you are at the edge of crisis, or when you when you're at the edge of tragedy, there's this hope that exists that it's kind of like when you reach this rock bottom, you're actually like, you start asking these questions that you don't have any answers for. For me, it was, why did this happen? Why him and not me? Why did I come into his life? Where is he? Like, all of these questions that just don't have answers. And then I had no choice but to start kind of listening for answers. And so what I found was that the answers that I was listening to were kind of adding up into this like very beautiful kind of sense for everything, meaning for everything. And all I had to do was listen to it and just kind of follow where it was guiding me. And I think that, like, you know, in this show, there's a very literal reasoning for it. But I think that at the edge of all crisis and all tragedy, there exists this hope that we can't quite tap into when we're just like kind of living in our normal lives. Just because we start to doubt ourselves, we start to doubt our connection to things we can't see. The noise just feels loud. Yeah.
That's pretty profound. That's why I kind of wanted to go back and have you explain that a little bit more. Yeah. But I imagine, you know, it sounds profound and it sounds beautiful, but, you know, I imagine getting to the point of understanding that, you know, was a process, right? I'm assuming so.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, it's funny because I kind of started I started writing this show because I had the ending. The ending is not the tragedy. The ending is not when he passes away. The ending is like this big understanding of what happens after that and the meaning behind it all. And I have found that as a we'll say quote unquote character in this show, which is just me, as a character in this show, I have written to heal myself through it. I knew that there was going to be some sort of journey of healing that I would need to reach to get to that ending, but I knew what the ending was.
What would you say to somebody that maybe is in the earlier stages of grief right now, or even, in the same stage that you might be in, I might be in, what would you say to somebody about their experience?
Yeah, I would say that it's an adventure. It will be an adventure. And I mean that in positive ways and in negative ways. It will be probably really, really unique to you and your relationship with that person. So treasure both the memories and, everything else that's a little more negative that could come with it. Not treasure, but like I would say explore those moments. For me, what encouraged me was that Jose was a VR video game designer. I wanted to tap into his legacy. And so I decided to explore my grief with the gusto of a video game designer. And I think that can be a somewhat universal approach to grief is don't be afraid to explore it. Those moments that feel so painful, trust them because they're leading you to some sort of healing. And the moments that are beautiful and funny are there for a reason too. And they're there to be appreciated as well. The turns can be really wild. Again, like an adventure, the turns can be really, really wild and really gnarly and really painful and really beautiful. So there's space for all of that within grief, and they can exist at the same time. Even if you are feeling, horrible and something beautiful happens, like explore it and make space for it all.
Julie, I appreciate your time. This was great.
Thanks, Juan. Thank you so much.
And in a way, I guess it's inspiring, to that she was able to do that, because a lot of times not everybody is able to do that. Like not everybody is able to turn like their loss into something, that they can share with others or into a form of art. Like you can't typically, like not everybody can do that. A lot of times people are in the process of grieving in some way in their lives, and we don't often share it, right? We don't often talk about it, like especially if it's not something as visible. Like if somebody passes away in your family, like people are gonna find out about it. Like somewhere, one way or another, people are gonna find out about it. They're gonna reach out, so people will reach out to you, or they'll know. But sometimes you might be grieving something that people don't know about. I think Julie and Letty shared some really informative tips. I think they shared some really good information how they dealt with it personally, and especially Letty, like how she deals with it, grief, on a professional level, in a way that sometimes you might not associate grief.
Yeah, it was an interesting topic for sure.
Yeah,
I liked it.
Thank you for watching. We appreciate you being here listening to us. And I do want to say that this show is brought to you by our friends at Comcast, who's one of our sponsors. And we're happy to be working with them. And they actually have some really good news that they've shared with us recently, that they just announced their Comcast Rise Award recipients in Houston. So 100 companies in Houston. Yeah,
I seen the list too. It was an amazing group of people.
Yeah, 100 companies in Houston.
I agree with each one of them.
Yeah. 100 companies in Houston received $10,000 grants each. So, like put the numbers together. You can do the math real quick. But like 100 companies, $10,000 grants. I mean, that's a little.
It's a pretty penny.
That's a pretty penny that you can, when especially in this climate, that you can do something with. So
there's a lot you can do that with.
Yeah, so we're excited for that. We're excited about Comcast doing that in the community, and we're gonna have probably one of our some of the recipients, have a conversation with them to kind of see
that'll be amazing,
what their plans are and what they're gonna do with that money. So
or how they maybe not finances, what they're gonna do, but how COVID has affected them, and the use of the money and how much needed and stuff like that. That kind of conversation, that would be awesome.
Yeah, because it might. I mean, for all case and purposes, it might just be payroll, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. But you never know. Typically,
we wanted to remind you also to rate us on Apple Podcasts. The higher the rating, obviously, the better. But the more ratings and the more I guess, review that you write, more people are capable of finding us. And if you enjoyed this, let us know. Give us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. Reach out to us. And I always say this every episode, and we get reached out to sometimes by you guys, just letting us know if you agreed or disagreed. This is all conversation, though. It's a two-way street. I know it's me and Juan here talking, but you can have a conversation with us in those DMs. Slide in. We'd love to talk to you. But yeah, that was an amazing conversation, Juan. Thanks.
All right. We'll see you on the next one.
And with that, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.